Hello, my YouTube family, and welcome back to Crime Whisper. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep, so before you drift off, take a moment to drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying tonight's story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a case. Alright, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's chilling story. Story 1. The tragedy of Fujiko and her son when police received the emergency call. Two officers immediately rushed to the scene, and what they found was utterly heartbreaking. Fujiko lay on the floor, her body covered in bruises, several ribs broken, and clear signs of a brutal beating. With a trembling voice, she managed to recount the horror she had just endured inside her own home. The attacker had tied her hands and feet with rope, leaving her completely helpless. It wasn't until around 4:15 a.m., after the perpetrator finally left, that Fujiko found the strength to free herself and call for help. But what shocked the officers most wasn't the brutality of the crime. It was the identity of the attacker. The person responsible for this horrific assault was none other than her own son, 30-year-old Daigo Akura. Recognizing the severity of the situation, police launched an immediate manhunt. While some officers stayed to protect Fujiko, others searched the nearby area. It didn't take long before, around 9 a.m., they spotted a young man acting suspiciously near the crime scene. When questioned, he was quickly identified as Daigo Akura. He offered no resistance and was arrested on charges of intentional assault and unlawful imprisonment. However, as investigators began their interrogation, a deeper and far more disturbing truth began to surface. Daigo was born in 1990 in the Nido area of Ikakawa City, Chiba Prefecture, into a fairly well-off family. His father worked in a prestigious advertising firm, and his mother, Fujiko, was employed as a temporary worker at the same company. For a while, their lives were peaceful. But in 1995, when Daigo was just 5 years old, everything changed. His father's job required relocation to England, and the entire family decided to move abroad. Life in a new country wasn't easy. They struggled with the language barrier and the challenges of adapting to an unfamiliar culture. Yet, young Daigo showed impressive adaptability. He picked up English quickly and seemed to settle in. But beneath that calm surface, cracks had begun to form. Fujiko's husband had a violent temper, and what began as arguments soon escalated into severe domestic violence. Terrified and emotionally drained, Fujiko finally made the painful decision to separate from her husband and raise Daigo on her own. Life as a single mother in a foreign country proved even harder. She worked tirelessly to support her son, all while facing harassment from her ex-husband. Eventually, realizing that England wasn't a safe or stable environment for Daigo, she made the heartbreaking choice to send him back to Japan when he was just 11 years old. Fujiko remained abroad, working to support him financially from afar. Back in Japan, Daigo lived with his maternal grandparents, aunt, and uncle, a family who tried to fill the emotional void left by his absent parents. He attended an international school, and though both parents were away, his father continued to fund his education. 2 years later, both parents returned to Japan and officially finalized their divorce. The court granted custody to Daigo's father, reuniting father and son after years apart. But that reunion didn't last long. Not long after Daigo's father remarried, and the arrival of a stepmother once again shattered the fragile balance of their family life. Feeling isolated and unwelcome in this new dynamic, Daigo's behavior began to change, marking the start of a long, dark descent that no one could have predicted. After his father remarried, Daigo began to feel out of place in his own home. To give him what he thought would be a better educational environment, Daigo's father decided to send him to a boarding school. For the first time, the teenager had to live completely on his own, far from family, in a place where independence wasn't a choice but a necessity. Surprisingly, Daigo adapted well. Despite all the instability in his family life, he excelled academically. His strong grades and intelligence carried him through high school and eventually earned him a spot at the University of British Columbia in Canada, a major achievement that made his mother, Fujiko, incredibly proud. But just as things were starting to look up, fate took another cruel turn. When Daigo needed financial support the most, his father suddenly refused to pay for his university tuition. Fujiko wanted to help, but with her modest income working abroad, she simply couldn't afford the enormous cost of living and studying in Canada. Cornered and desperate not to give up on his future, Daigo made a fateful decision. He began selling illegal substances. With his intelligence and ability to stay calm under pressure, Daigo managed to earn enough to pay for his studies and living expenses. Against all odds, he completed his degree and returned to Japan as a university graduate from a prestigious foreign institution. Soon after, he landed a job at a multinational company, earning over $5,200 per month, an impressive figure for someone his age. His career rose quickly, and his life finally seemed to be on the right track. It was at this point that Daigo met Yuko, a bright and talented colleague. Their connection was instant, and their relationship grew quickly. Within months, they were living together, though not yet legally married. In October 2018, the couple purchased a luxury apartment worth more than 10.8 million yen in Minato Ward, one of Tokyo's most prestigious neighborhoods. Then, in January 2019, Yuko gave birth to their first son. From the outside, their life looked perfect. A high-income job, a beautiful home, a loving partner, and a healthy baby. But beneath that perfect picture, cracks were beginning to form once again. As Daigo's income grew, so did his desire for material luxury. He began spending recklessly, living far beyond his means. Before long, his finances spiraled out of control. To cover his growing expenses, he started selling valuable items online, many of which weren't even his. Shockingly, he began stealing from relatives' homes to fuel his lifestyle, and inside his own household. Things were getting worse. Daigo's temper, something he had inherited from his father, began to surface. Just 3 months after his son's birth, he was arrested for domestic violence against Yuko, though he avoided prosecution by paying $22,400 in compensation. The damage to their relationship was irreparable. By October 2019, less than a year after buying their apartment, Yuko finally left Daigo, taking their child with her. Their relationship, once full of promise, was over. Daigo stayed behind in the apartment, living alone. Not long after, he began dating another woman named Miwa. He grew increasingly distant from Yuko and their son, completely cutting off contact and refusing to take responsibility as a father. Yuko eventually took legal action, demanding child support and a fair division of their shared assets. After court mediation, she won full custody of their child and secured compensation for her contributions to the apartment's mortgage. Daigo kept ownership of the apartment, but with it came enormous debt. Though he still had a good job, Daigo's uncontrolled spending habits left him drowning in bills. To keep up, he began taking loans from multiple financial institutions, borrowing from one to pay another. Within a year, his total debt had skyrocketed to over $224,000. In desperation, he turned to his uncle Watanobu, asking for a $172,000 loan. Wada and his wife Junko had always treated Daigo like their own son, and without hesitation, they helped him. But instead of stabilizing his life, Daigo used the money recklessly, and his debts only deepened. By late 2020, Daigo's life was in ruins. On December 6th, he sold a pearl ring and several family heirlooms without permission. When his mother Fujiko discovered what he had done, she was furious and demanded that he return everything immediately. But Daigo was already too far gone mentally, emotionally, and financially. On December 7th, Daigo went to Fujiko's home. What started as an argument over the stolen jewelry quickly turned violent. In a moment of uncontrollable rage, Daigo strangled his mother, then pushed her to the ground and stomped on her repeatedly. That the attack left Fujiko with multiple broken ribs and severe injuries all over her body, injuries so brutal that doctors said it would take at least 2 weeks to recover. And yet, this was only the beginning of the horror to come. After Fujiko's hospitalization, Daigo seemed to calm down, at least on the surface. For a short while, he stopped stealing from relatives, but instead of changing his ways, he simply shifted his target. In February 2021, Daigo broke into the company's safe at his workplace and stole cash. The theft was quickly discovered, and this time there was no escaping justice. He was immediately arrested by police and fired from his job. Just like that, the once respected employee with a good income and a loving family had lost everything: his career, his reputation, and the trust of those around him. With no stable income and mounting debts, Daigo's situation worsened rapidly. He could no longer afford the luxurious lifestyle he was addicted to, nor could he qualify for new loans from financial institutions. Drowning in tens of millions of yen in debt, Daigo was like a man clinging to his final lifeline. It was then that he came across something that seemed like a miracle, a financial program called the reverse mortgage system. The concept was simple, yet tempting. Homeowners could use their property as collateral to borrow money while still living in it. Once approved, they'd receive a lump sum payment, followed by monthly living allowances. Best of all, they didn't have to repay anything during their lifetime. After their death, the bank would recover the loan by selling the property. It was marketed as the perfect solution for elderly homeowners, a way to enjoy life comfortably without leaving their homes to Daigo. This sounded like the answer to all his problems. He immediately thought of his grandmother's house, estimating that if he could mortgage it, he might receive around $299,000, enough to erase most of his debt. But when he dug deeper into the legal details, his plan hit a major obstacle. The reverse mortgage program required the legal owner of the house, the person listed on the property deed, to be the one actually living in it. And this was where Daigo's plan fell apart. After her divorce, Daigo's aunt Hiroko had moved in with their elderly grandmother. She cared for the old woman daily and lived there permanently, but she wasn't the legal owner of the property. The house was still under Daigo's grandmother's name. Because of this, Daigo's loan application couldn't go through. Once again, he found himself trapped in a financial dead end. Desperate, Daigo turned to the one person who had always helped him, his uncle Watanabe. This time, he asked for another $89,600, bringing the total amount he owed his uncle to an enormous sum. Despite everything, Watanabe's heart softened once again, out of love and compassion. He agreed to help Daigo, but instead of feeling gratitude toward the man who treated him like a son, Daigo began to plot something unthinkable. While helping his uncle organize some household belongings, Daigo secretly stole spare keys to the house and a credit card registered under Watanabe's mother's name. Then, on April 2nd, Daigo went even further. He stole 2 valuable paintings from his uncle's personal collection. The very next day, those paintings appeared for sale on online marketplaces. As if that wasn't enough, Daigo used the stolen credit card to buy himself a Rolex watch. And shockingly, he didn't act alone. This time, he involved his own mother, Fujiko, turning her into an unwilling accomplice. When purchasing the Rolex, Fujiko pretended to be Watanabe's mother, forging her signature to authorize the credit card transaction. But on April 4th, Watanabe discovered everything. The paintings were gone, and his mother's card showed multiple suspicious transactions. He checked his home's security camera footage, and what he saw left him speechless. It was Daigo and Fujiko. They had betrayed him completely. Yet even after such a cruel betrayal, Watanabe couldn't bring himself to destroy his nephew's life. With a forgiving heart, he withdrew his police report, telling himself that perhaps this was just a misunderstanding or confusion caused by his elderly mother. He hoped that, through conversation, things could be resolved peacefully. That evening, Watanabe invited Daigo to his home in Funabashi City for a private talk. He wanted to clear the air, not through anger, but through understanding. During their meeting, faced with undeniable evidence, Daigo finally admitted his guilt. He promised to repay the $6,700 he had illegally charged to the credit card. But what Watanabe didn't know was that Daigo was completely broke. He had no job, no money, and no way to make things right. And beneath his calm expression that night, Daigo was already hiding something far darker. After his meeting with Uncle Watanabe, Daigo appeared calm, polite, and remorseful, but inside, his thoughts were in turmoil. He had no money, no job, and no realistic way to repay the thousands he'd stolen. The guilt he showed was an act. In truth, Daigo's mind had reached a breaking point. He began to see everyone around him, not as family, not as loved ones, but as obstacles standing between him and the life he thought he deserved. In the days following that tense meeting, Daigo avoided his uncle's calls. Watanabe, still hoping for a peaceful resolution, tried to stay patient. But Daigo was already spiraling. Every passing day, without money or stability, pushed him closer to desperation. Then came April 10th, 2021. That morning, Watanabe, as he often did, visited his mother's house in Chiba Prefecture to check in on her. Neighbors later recalled seeing Daigo's car parked quietly a few streets away, the engine off. He had been waiting. Around 7:30 a.m., Watanabe's elderly mother, unaware of the danger approaching, opened her front door after hearing a knock. What happened next would haunt the small community forever. Daigo forced his way into the house. He had come prepared: gloves, a rope, and a knife. Inside, he confronted Watanabe's mother, demanding access to the property deed and her bank information. When she refused, Daigo's frustration exploded into violence. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, he strangled her, then used the rope to tie her hands and feet, just as he had done to his own mother months before. But the horror didn't end there. Moments later, Watanabe himself arrived, only to find Daigo standing in the hallway. Startled, Watanabe demanded to know what was happening. The confrontation quickly turned violent. In the chaos that followed, Daigo attacked his uncle, beating him repeatedly until he collapsed. By the time police were called, alerted by a neighbor who heard loud noises, it was too late. When officers arrived, they found a horrifying scene. Watanabe's mother lay lifeless on the floor. Watanabe himself was unconscious, but still breathing, barely clinging to life. Daigo, realizing what he had done, fled the house and tried to escape by car. But just hours later, police spotted his vehicle parked near the coast. He was sitting inside, motionless, staring out at the water. When officers approached, Daigo didn't resist. He simply said in a low voice, "It's over." He was immediately arrested. During interrogation, Daigo showed little emotion. He confessed in chilling detail, admitting that his actions had been driven by desperation and resentment. He told investigators that he couldn't take it anymore, and that the people around him didn't understand how hard his life had become. The public was stunned. How could a man once described as intelligent, educated, and full of potential end up here, a murderer, driven by greed and ego? As the investigation unfolded, the shocking pattern became clear. Daigo had built his entire life on borrowed time, borrowed money, borrowed trust, borrowed love, until everything finally collapsed in 2022. Daigo Akura was formally charged with murder, theft, and fraud. During trial, prosecutors emphasized his calculated behavior, noting that he had manipulated and betrayed every person who had ever helped him, including his own mother. The court found him guilty on all charges, sentencing him to life imprisonment. When the verdict was read, Daigo showed no emotion, no tears, no words, only silence. Fujiko, now permanently scarred by both physical and emotional wounds, chose not to attend the final hearing. Through her lawyer, she released a brief statement saying, "The boy I once loved no longer exists. I only hope no other mother has to face what I've lived through." And just like that, the Akura family, once a picture of stability and hope, was gone, destroyed by greed, pride, and silence. After Daigo's sentencing, most people thought the case was over, that justice had been served, and life could quietly move on. But for the few who truly knew the Akura family, the scars never healed. Fujiko withdrew completely from public life. She sold her home in Chiba, left her job, and moved to a small apartment near the coast, the same coastline where Daigo had been arrested. Neighbors described her as polite but distant. She rarely spoke and almost never smiled. Every morning, she would leave flowers by the shore. When asked who they were for, she simply said, "Someone who lost his way." Her relatives, too, carried the weight of what had happened. Uncle Watanabe never fully recovered from his injuries. The attack had left him partially blind in one eye and with lasting trauma. He later told a local newspaper, "The hardest part isn't forgiving him, it's accepting that I never really knew him." Daigo, meanwhile, adapted quickly to prison life. Guards described him as calm, obedient, even polite. He spent most of his time reading philosophy and writing letters that he never sent. When asked why he didn't mail them, he replied, "Because the person I want to talk to doesn't exist anymore." Psychological evaluations painted a chilling picture. Despite being fully aware of his crimes, Daigo showed almost no remorse. Instead, he spoke about them as if they were logical outcomes, steps in a life that, according to him, had been doomed from the moment he was sent away as a child. By 2024, the case had largely faded from headlines, but those who followed it closely noticed one curious detail. Every year, on April 10th, the date of the murders, a small anonymous donation was made to a local women's shelter in Chiba. No name, no note, only a brief message attached. For the ones who choose to protect, not harm. No one knows who sends it. Some believe it's a supporter of Fuji, others think it's from her, an act of quiet redemption. But a few whisper a darker theory, that it's Daigo himself, using the only means he has left to atone. And that, my friends, brings us to the quiet end of tonight's story. A story that began with love and ended with loss. A reminder that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes, it wears the face of someone you once tucked into bed. If you're still awake, take a deep breath, let it go, and remember the world outside your window is full of light. Even after hearing stories like these, by any means she could, with trembling hands and sheer desperation, she managed to free herself. The ropes had burned her wrists raw, and every breath she took was filled with the smell of gasoline that still lingered in the air. At 4:15 a.m., she stumbled to the phone and made the emergency call that would finally expose the horror her son had become. When officers arrived, the scene was one of both chaos and silence. Fujiko, her face swollen and bloodied, could barely speak, but between sobs, she managed to tell them everything about the poison, the threats, the fire, and the night her family was destroyed from within. Police immediately dispatched patrols across Funabashi City. The fire at Watanabe's house had already been reported by neighbors. Flames lit up the night sky, and the smell of burning wood and plastic carried 4 blocks. When firefighters finally brought the inferno under control, the body of Uncle Watanabe was discovered in what remained of the second floor hallway, just a few steps away from the window he had tried to reach before collapsing. Forensic analysis confirmed that the fire had been deliberately set using gasoline, and traces of the same brand of lighter fluid were later found in Daigo's car. By morning, investigators had pieced together enough evidence to begin their pursuit. Dago was spotted near a convenience store only a few kilometers from the crime scene, pacing restlessly, his clothes still reeking faintly of fuel. At 9 a.m., police moved in and arrested him without resistance. Witnesses later described his expression as empty, not fearful, not angry, simply devoid of emotion. During questioning, Dago's statements were chillingly calm. He admitted to everything: the antifreeze poisoning, the staged fall, the arson, the assault on his mother. When asked why, he replied with a tone that made even the veteran detectives fall silent. They were all problems I needed to solve. This was just cleaning up. It was that same detachment that convinced prosecutors to seek the maximum sentence. In court, Dago's defense team tried to argue diminished capacity due to mental illness, but psychological evaluations found him fully aware and in control of his actions. Fujiko, now bearing both the physical and emotional scars of that night, appeared in court, not as a defendant, but as a witness. When asked if she had anything to say to her son, she whispered, "I wish I had never sent you away." The trial was long and heavily covered by Japanese media. The public was horrified, not only by the brutality of the crimes, but by the cold, methodical nature of Dago's behavior. How he turned his intelligence and knowledge into tools of destruction. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom was silent. Dago Okura was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. A sentence many believed was too lenient given the cruelty of his actions. As for Fujiko, she chose not to appeal or speak publicly again. She later moved to a quiet coastal town, where she lives in near-complete isolation. The tragedy of the Okura family became one of the most haunting cases in Chiba Prefecture's history, not because of how Dago killed, but because of who he chose to destroy, the very people who had loved him most. Version of the story, calling Dago's claims a desperate fabrication to escape responsibility. According to the prosecution, every step Dago took from purchasing gasoline and antifreeze to studying arson videos and manipulating his mother demonstrated meticulous premeditation. They emphasized that this was not the act of a man driven by sudden emotion, but of someone who had calculated death as a solution to his own financial ruin. To support their argument, investigators presented digital evidence recovered from Dago's computer and phone. Search histories showed repeated entries like how to kill without trace, ethylene glycol, lethal dose, and how long until fire kills a person. Furthermore, security camera footage captured Dago's car passing by Watanabe's residence minutes before the blaze began, along with traces of gasoline residue found on his clothing at the time of arrest. When confronted with this overwhelming evidence, Dago maintained a cold, detached composure, even as the prosecution played videos of the burning house and read autopsy results describing Watanabe's prolonged suffering before death. Dago showed no visible remorse. He only muttered, "It's unfortunate, but it was never meant to go that far." This chilling indifference left the courtroom in stunned silence. During closing arguments, the prosecutor delivered a powerful statement. The defendant did not simply kill his family. He erased the very meaning of family. Those who trusted him most became victims of his greed and lies. This was not madness. This was choice. When it came time for sentencing, the presiding judge described Dago's crimes as unprecedented in cruelty and betrayal. He ruled that Dago Okura's actions demonstrated a complete lack of humanity, rejecting all claims of temporary insanity or cultural misunderstanding. On March 3, 2023, the Chiba District Court handed down its final verdict. Dago Okura was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In delivering the sentence, the judge declared, "The court recognizes no trace of repentance. The defendant's crimes are unforgivable. The victims were his own flesh and blood, people who extended to him love and trust. For such cruelty, society can offer no leniency." As the guards led Dago away, he turned briefly toward his mother. but his expression remained blank. Fujiko wept silently, perhaps mourning not only the victims, but the son she had already lost long before the murders. After the case concluded, the story of Daigo Okura became one of Japan's most shocking family crime cases in decades, a dark reminder of how greed and resentment can hollow out the human heart until nothing remains but emptiness. Had entered the apartment and turned the scene into chaos before vanishing without a trace. These questions loomed heavily over the investigators as they combed through every inch of the blood-stained room. The air was thick with the metallic scent of dried blood and something else, an unsettling stillness, as if the walls themselves had witnessed something unspeakable. Drawers were pulled open, objects scattered, and faint drag marks could be seen leading from the kitchen area toward the bathroom. The officers followed the trail with tense, measured steps. Inside the small bathroom, they found the first true clue, a piece of torn fabric, matching the apron worn by the missing Vietnamese employee, and several strands of long black hair tangled near the drain. It was clear the woman had been inside that apartment. Detectives quickly sealed off the building, turning the entire area into a crime scene. Neighbors were questioned. Most described the 59-year-old man, later identified as Katsuhiko Tanaka, as quiet and polite, though some admitted they'd occasionally heard strange noises at night, dragging sounds, muffled thuds, and once, a woman crying softly. Meanwhile, forensic teams recovered key evidence, faint traces of blood leading to the back balcony, a discarded plastic sheet, and a section of the tatami mat that appeared recently cleaned, but not well enough. Under luminol, it glowed in eerie blue, revealing large splatters of blood that had been hastily wiped away. At 8 a.m. the next morning, investigators received a hospital update. Tanaka had regained consciousness. Still weak, he was placed under police guard. When asked about the missing Vietnamese employee, his eyes flickered in panic, and his lips trembled before whispering. She wouldn't stop screaming. The room fell silent. Detectives pressed for more, but Tanaka's voice broke. He muttered incoherent words about a mistake, a misunderstanding, and punishment. Before he could say more, his blood pressure plummeted, and doctors ordered everyone out. With Tanaka incapacitated and no body found, police intensified their search. Garbage collection routes were checked, nearby rivers dredged, and CCTV footage from surrounding streets meticulously reviewed. That's when, 3 days later, an image surfaced that would shatter any remaining hope. A dark silhouette dragging a large, heavy plastic bag out the back of the building around 9:10 a.m., barely 30 minutes after the woman was last seen alive. The figure was Katsuhiko Tanaka. The next phase of the investigation would uncover a level of brutality and coldness that few could imagine, and a motive rooted not in passion, but in quiet, festering obsession, desperation, and in that darkness, even a moment of temptation could become fatal. Yet, as the investigation deepened, something about this case began to unsettle even the most experienced detectives. Robbery alone didn't explain the level of brutality. The way the victim was killed, strangled with tremendous force, her body meticulously wrapped and hidden, pointed to something far more personal, more obsessive. Over the following days, investigators worked to reconstruct Yamaguchi's final movements before the murder. Surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store revealed him purchasing a large vacuum storage bag, duct tape, and cleaning supplies just 2 days before the incident, the same type found at the crime scene. The time stamp was precise. April 1st, 9:27 p.m. He paid in cash and left the store, carrying the plastic bag with an eerie calmness. Interviews with neighbors further confirmed Yamaguchi's increasingly unstable behavior in the weeks leading up to the murder. He had been seen standing by his window at odd hours, staring silently at the bento shop below, watching the employees come and go. One neighbor recalled hearing him whisper repeatedly, "She's too kind for this world." At first, the words seemed meaningless, but after the tragedy, they took on a chilling new resonance. Investigators soon discovered that Yamaguchi had become fixated on Gwen. He often lingered near the shop, sometimes buying food he never ate, just to speak with her briefly. To her, he was likely just another lonely customer, polite but awkward. But to him, those small exchanges had become a lifeline, a fragile thread of warmth in his cold, isolated world. According to the forensic timeline, police believe that on the morning of April 3rd, Yamaguchi waited outside until Gwen's break. He invited her upstairs, possibly under the pretense of helping him with something trivial, perhaps a favor, perhaps to return an item. Surveillance footage showed her following him calmly, unaware of the danger waiting inside that dim, silent room. What happened next was reconstructed from the blood patterns, autopsy findings, and faint partial fingerprints found on the victim's neck and clothing. Inside that small apartment, a conversation had likely turned tense. Maybe Yamaguchi confessed his feelings, maybe she rejected them. At some point, words turned to rage. He grabbed her from behind, pressing his hands against her throat until she could no longer struggle. When it was over, Yamaguchi sat motionless for several minutes, staring at the still body on the floor. Then, in a panic, he began to clean, wrapping her in the vacuum bag, sealing it tightly, and hiding it behind the TV stand. The rest of the day, he wandered aimlessly inside the room, the weight of what he had done closing in on him. Finally, as night fell, he turned the knife on himself, a shallow, desperate wound that failed to end his life. By the time police arrived, it was already too late for Gwen. News of the case spread rapidly across Osaka and through the Vietnamese community across Japan. Vigils were held in both Osaka and Hanoi, with friends and relatives lighting candles and praying for her soul. The small bento shop where she once worked became an impromptu memorial, filled with flowers, letters, and photographs of her smiling face. For investigators, this case was more than another line in their files. It became a haunting reminder that behind the walls of even the quietest neighborhoods, unimaginable tragedies could unfold, and that loneliness, left unchecked, could grow into something monstrous. In the early months of 2022, Yamaguchi Toshiya's life had fallen into a bleak spiral. Living in a cramped second-floor apartment above a small bento shop in Osaka, he spent his days in near isolation, worrying about rent, debt, and the simple question of how to survive the next week. Each morning, he would shuffle downstairs to buy a meal, quietly observing the shop's employees as they prepared food for the day. Among them, one person began to stand out, the Vietnamese worker who always arrived early, smiling politely even in the rush of the morning tour. Yamaguchi was just another regular customer, a quiet tenant from upstairs. But to him, she became a symbol of stability and warmth, something he had long lost. As his financial troubles deepened, the fragile line between admiration and desperation began to blur. On the night of April 2nd, 2022, after receiving yet another notice demanding overdue rent, Yamaguchi's anxiety reached its peak. Sitting alone in the dim light of his apartment, he convinced himself that robbing the woman downstairs would be a quick way to escape his misery. He reasoned that she often carried cash, and that taking it would be just one time. By the next morning, his reckless plan had solidified. Around 8 a.m., he went to the bento shop earlier than usual, before it opened. Pretending to have a message from the shop owner, he told Lu Wang that her boss needed her help upstairs for a moment. Trusting him completely, she followed. The moment the apartment door closed, everything changed. According to Yamaguchi's later confession, he stood behind her and applied a chokehold, a technique he claimed to have seen on a judo program on television. He said his intention was only to make her lose consciousness so he could take her money without resistance. But the force he used was far too strong. Within seconds, Luong stopped breathing. In the silence that followed, panic took over. Realizing what he had done, Yamaguchi searched her handbag, taking 26,000 yen, about 180 US dollars. But rather than feeling relief, he was overcome with dread. In shock, he wrapped her body in a vacuum-sealed plastic bag, taped it tightly, and hid it behind the TV stand. Then, as evening approached, he took a kitchen knife and slashed his own neck, a half-hearted attempt to take his life that stopped short of death. When police broke into the apartment later that night, they found him barely conscious, surrounded by blood, with the room silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sealed plastic bag that concealed his victim. Investigators later confirmed through forensic and digital evidence that Yamaguchi acted alone, motivated purely by financial despair. His search history showed phrases like "how to die painlessly" and "life insurance for poor people," painting a picture of a man who had long surrendered to hopelessness. Experts from Osaka Prefectural Police's Psychological Analysis Division described him as a socially withdrawn individual whose desperation replaced reason. The murder, they said, was not premeditated in the traditional sense, but it was the outcome of a mind that had collapsed under the weight of poverty, isolation, and emotional decay. On April 6, 2022, after gathering full evidence and securing his confession, police officially arrested Yamaguchi Toshiya on charges of robbery and murder. He was transferred to the Osaka Detention Center, his neck wound now healed, left to await trial for a crime that had shocked both Japan and the Vietnamese community. She was a foreigner in a strange land, quiet, hardworking, and always polite. Perhaps that was why Yamaguchi Toshio believed she wouldn't resist. In his twisted logic, it made his plan seem easier, almost safe. At 8:30 a.m. on April 3, 2022, Yamaguchi woke earlier than usual. He slipped into his worn camouflage outfit, slid a roll of duct tape and a small knife into his pocket, and made his way downstairs. Through the glass of the bento shop, he saw Gwyn, the Vietnamese worker, arranging items for the morning rush. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open, pretending to be in a hurry. "The boss needs you upstairs," he lied smoothly. Though puzzled, Gwyn trusted the familiar face of the man who lived above the shop. She removed her apron, grabbed her wallet and phone, and followed him up the narrow staircase, inside the dim, cluttered apartment. Nothing seemed unusual until Yamaguchi quietly locked the door. His voice changed. His eyes hardened. He demanded she hand over her money. Startled, Gwyn refused, warning she would call the police. That defiance shattered his plan. In panic, he lunged, covering her mouth as she screamed for help. As she struggled, he moved behind her, wrapping his arms tightly around her neck. Gwyn fought desperately, scratching and clawing, but Yamaguchi only squeezed harder until she fell limp to the floor. Silence returned. For a long moment, he stood frozen, horrified by what he had done. Then, fear replaced shock. He searched her wallet, taking 26,000 yen, roughly $180, and pocketed the cash. Her phone, he switched off and hid behind a cabinet to conceal the body. Yamaguchi dragged out a vacuum-sealed plastic bag used for storing blankets. He folded Gwyn's body inside, sealing it shut with thick duct tape, and pushed it behind the TV stand. By 9:30 a.m., the room was eerily calm again, save for the scratches on his hands and the faint smell of tape. By midday, he used the stolen money to buy sake and cigarettes, hoping the alcohol would dull his terror. But instead, guilt grew heavier. As evening fell, police knocked on his door, asking routine questions about the missing worker. Yamaguchi froze, pretending not to hear. When the knocking persisted, he snapped. Grabbing a kitchen knife, he slashed his own neck, a desperate attempt to escape punishment. It didn't work. At 11:35 p.m., police broke down the door. They found Yamaguchi bleeding but alive, and Gwyn's body, Sealed and hidden behind the television, the case shocked Japan and sent waves of grief through the Vietnamese community. After 9 months of investigation, Yamaguchi's trial opened at the Osaka District Court in early 2023. But in a surprising turn, he retracted his confession, claiming he had no intent to rob or kill. He said he only wanted to borrow money, insisting the death was accidental. His lawyer pushed to reduce the charge to causing injury resulting in death, arguing for a 15-year sentence. The prosecution, however, came prepared. They reconstructed the crime scene, demonstrating how Yamaguchi's chokehold was deliberate and prolonged proof of intent. They also showed that his theft afterward fulfilled the criteria for robbery-murder under Japanese law. The courtroom grew silent as CCTV footage played, Gwen smiling as she left the shop with Yamaguchi that morning, her final moments of life. Many in attendance wept when those images were juxtaposed with photos of the plastic bag found in the apartment. On February 3, 2023, the judge delivered the verdict. The court accepted the prosecution's full argument, declaring that Yamaguchi Toshio had committed robbery and murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, the heaviest punishment short of death. Yamaguchi lowered his head without a word. Under Japanese law, he would be eligible for parole only after 35 years, provided he showed exemplary behavior. In the gallery, Gwen's family held her portrait and wept softly. The pain will never disappear, they said, but at least justice was done. Though Yamaguchi initially considered appealing, he later withdrew the attempt and accepted the sentence. And so, the case was officially closed in February 2023. A young woman's life ended for 26,000 yen, a mere $180, a price far too small for a human life, for the dreams she carried, and for the silence she left behind, seriousness of the situation, that her two close friends had vanished without contact for over 24 hours. And both were extremely responsible individuals. Her desperate tone finally convinced the landlord to make an exception, and together they went to notify the building manager and local police. A short while later, officers arrived at the apartment to conduct an emergency welfare check. When the door was unlocked, the sight inside was deeply unsettling. The lights were off, curtains drawn, and the room looked as though time had stopped. On the table were unfinished meals, and 2 mobile phone chargers still plugged into the wall, but both phones were missing. There were no clear signs of struggle, yet something felt unmistakably wrong. The police began gathering witness statements from neighbors. Several recalled seeing the sisters a few nights earlier, around July 6th, talking to a man in his mid-20s near the entrance of the building. He appeared to be Japanese, wore a baseball cap, and spoke in a casual but slightly commanding tone. One resident noted that the sisters seemed uneasy during the exchange, though they eventually left together in the man's car. Investigators immediately reviewed nearby CCTV footage, confirming this account. The footage showed the sisters walking toward a silver compact vehicle parked on the roadside, driven by a man later identified as Hironoki Yohei, age 39, an unemployed local man living in nearby Hidano City. What made the case more alarming was that Hirano had previously been involved in fraud and assault cases, though he had avoided prison through suspended sentences. With mounting evidence, police obtained a search warrant for Hirano's residence. When they arrived, the small apartment appeared hastily cleaned, but traces of blood were discovered in the bathroom and trunk of his car. DNA tests later confirmed the samples matched both sisters. Under questioning, Hirano initially denied knowing the victims, but when confronted with the CCTV footage, he broke down. His confession was cold and emotionless. According to him, he had met Bolin through an online chat app months earlier, pretending to be a business recruiter. He lured her with promises of a part-time modeling job, eventually meeting her in person several times. When Bolin later discovered his lies and tried to cut contact, he grew angry and obsessive. On July 6th, He visited her apartment under the pretense of reconciliation. However, when her younger sister Bizan intervened and asked him to leave, an argument broke out that escalated violently. Hirano admitted to strangling both sisters, claiming it happened in a moment of panic. After realizing what he had done, he bought 2 large suitcases, stuffed the bodies inside, and drove to the remote forest area of Hadano City to dispose of them. He left them hidden among the bushes, believing no one would ever find them. The autopsy report revealed that both sisters had died from manual strangulation, with additional bruises suggesting a violent struggle. The timeline confirmed they had been killed on the same night they disappeared. The news of the sisters' deaths spread rapidly across both Japan and China, sparking widespread outrage and grief. Thousands of online messages flooded social media, mourning their tragic end and condemning the suspects' cruelty. The Chinese embassy in Tokyo publicly demanded a thorough and transparent investigation to ensure justice. During his trial at the Yokohama District Court in 2019, Hirano's defense claimed diminished mental capacity, arguing that his unstable emotions led to impulsive behavior rather than premeditated murder. However, the prosecution refuted this, presenting evidence of deliberate planning, including the purchase of the suitcases and cleaning supplies prior to the crime. In court, members of the Chen family traveled from China to attend the proceedings. The father, Mr. Chen, broke down as he addressed the court. "They were my daughters, good, kind, and full of hope. They came to Japan to study and build a better life. Instead, they met a monster." On November 12, 2019, the court announced its verdict. Judge Kondo stated that Hirano's actions were cold-blooded, selfish, and demonstrated no respect for human life. The court sentenced him to death, the ultimate penalty under Japanese law. As the sentence was read, Hirano showed little reaction. The victim's family wept silently, clutching each other for support. The Hadano suitcase murders, as the case came to be known, left a deep scar on both nations, a haunting reminder of the vulnerabilities faced by foreign students far from home. It was a tragedy born from deceit, obsession, and unchecked violence. To young lives full of promise, ended in a foreign land, for no reason other than crossing paths with evil in the bustling yet impoverished Nishinari ward of Osaka, a place known for its narrow alleys, neon-lit bars, and low-rent apartments. A quiet tragedy began to unfold in late 2019. It started like many other cases, with a person simply vanishing. The missing woman was Nguyen Thi Than, a 28 Vietnamese technical trainee working at a food processing factory in southern Osaka. She had arrived in Japan just 2 years earlier under the government's foreign worker program, a system designed to fill labor shortages, but often criticized for exploitation. Than was cheerful, hardworking, and deeply trusted by her colleagues. Every day, she took the same bus route, worked long shifts, and then returned to her shared apartment. She also kept in regular contact with her younger brother back home in Vietnam, sending part of her monthly salary to support their aging parents. But on the evening of November 9, 2019, Than failed to return home after her shift. Her roommate, Lynn, noticed she hadn't answered messages since 5:30 p.m., and her phone went straight to voicemail. At first, Lynn thought Than might have gone shopping or met friends. But as midnight came and went, her worry grew into dread. The next morning, Lynn reported Than missing to the Osaka Prefectural Police, and the investigation began. The first place police checked was the CCTV footage near the factory. At 5:18 p.m., Than could be seen leaving through the front gate, wearing her gray work jacket and carrying a white tote bag. She looked tired but calm. Minutes later, another camera captured her walking toward Dobatsunmei Station, but someone was following her. A man, mid-30s, wearing a black hoodie, white mask, and a backpack. He maintained a distance of roughly 10 meters, his movements cautious, deliberate. That was the last known sighting of Than alive. Over the following days, police combed through her digital trail, her phone's GPS, transit card records, and financial transactions. Everything stopped abruptly after 5:45 p.m. that night. Then came a chilling discovery, inside a coin locker near the station. Police found Than's tote bag, still containing her ID, wallet, and house key, but not her phone. This immediately suggested foul play. Meanwhile, Lin told police about a man who had recently started bothering Than, a Japanese co-worker named Saito Masaki, aged 34. Saito often tried to start conversations with her during lunch breaks, offered her rides home, and even once followed her to the bus stop. Than had confided to Lin that Saito's behavior made her uncomfortable. "He's always watching me," she had texted. "I told him to stop, but he doesn't listen." Police soon located Saito's apartment, less than 800 meters from where Than disappeared. When officers knocked, no one answered. After obtaining a warrant, they entered, and what they found inside stunned them. In the corner of the room, beneath a thick plastic sheet, lay a rolled futon secured tightly with duct tape. When opened, it revealed Than's body. The autopsy determined she had been strangled to death. Time of death, approximately between 6 o'clock and 6:30 p.m. on November 9th. Less than an hour after she left work, Saito was immediately arrested. During interrogation, his demeanor was emotionless. He first claimed it was an accident, that Than had come to his room voluntarily, and that they argued. But as investigators confronted him with overwhelming evidence, the CCTV footage, duct tape purchases from a nearby convenience store, and Than's fingerprints found on his jacket sleeve, he eventually confessed. He admitted that he had developed feelings for Than, and when she rejected him repeatedly, he lost control. He followed her home, forced her into his apartment, and during a heated confrontation, strangled her without realizing what he was doing. The confession did not ease public anger. When the case reached trial, in mid-2021, it became a national flashpoint in Japan's debate over the treatment and safety of foreign workers. Prosecution described Saito's actions as calculated, predatory, and driven by possessive obsession. During the sentencing hearing at the Osaka District Court, Than's brother appeared via video from Vietnam. His words pierced the courtroom's silence. "My sister went to Japan believing it was a land of safety and opportunity, but she was killed by someone she worked with. Our parents can't sleep. They wait every night, hoping it's just a nightmare." The judge condemned Saito's lack of empathy, calling his act an inexcusable abuse of trust and power. In October 2021, Saito Masaki was sentenced to life imprisonment. Outside the court, members of the Vietnamese community gathered, holding candles and pictures of Than. Some wept silently. Others demanded stronger protections for foreign women working in Japan. The Nishinari case, as it came to be known, became one of the key catalysts for policy reform, prompting both the Vietnamese and Japanese governments to review safety measures for overseas workers. For Than's family, however, no justice could restore what was lost. A daughter, a sister, and a dream gone in a foreign land she once believed would change her life for the better. Dead. That realization shattered Miss A's composure completely. The police, too, were shaken by how close she had been to walking in on the killer that night. Just a thin door, and perhaps a few minutes, separated her from becoming another victim. The case, now officially declared a double homicide, was assigned to Osaka's Major Crimes Division. Investigators began by identifying the mysterious young man seen in the footage. His face was partially revealed in the final clip, when he no longer wore his hat or mask. Using advanced facial recognition software and local resident records, police quickly narrowed it down to one suspect, Ryohei Matsuda, a 26-year-old part-time delivery driver who had previously lived on the same floor as the sisters. According to the landlord, Matsuda had moved out 2 months earlier, but never returned his spare key. At the time, no one thought much of it. He was quiet, polite, and often kept to himself. But neighbors later admitted they had occasionally seen him lingering near the building, sometimes late at night, staring up at the sisters' apartment window. When police raided his small rented room in Sakai City, they found what they feared most: the 2 missing suitcases. Inside were traces of blood, hair, and clothing fibers matching the sisters. Forensic testing later confirmed it. These were the very bags used to dispose of their bodies. Matsuda himself was gone. A nationwide manhunt was launched, and his image flooded every news outlet. Witnesses soon reported seeing a man matching his description boarding a ferry bound for Kagoshima, in Japan's southern region. Detectives coordinated with local authorities, tracing his movements to a rural mountain in where he had been hiding for several days, using a fake name. When police finally surrounded the building on the evening of July 10th, Matsuda didn't resist. He was found sitting by the window, staring blankly at the forest outside. On the table beside him was a small notebook. Inside, he had written a single line over and over again: "I didn't mean to do it. I just wanted to see her one more time." During interrogation, Matsuda confessed in chilling detail. He had once been infatuated with Baozen, the younger sister, while living in the same building. When she ignored his advances, his obsession deepened. On July 5th, he decided to visit her, but instead broke into the apartment using the key he still had. When the older sister confronted him, he panicked and strangled her. Later that morning, when Bo returned from work, she discovered what he'd done, and he killed her too. He spent the next day disposing of the bodies, cleaning the apartment, and even spraying deodorizer to mask the smell. His final act, returning to retrieve the suitcases, was captured clearly on the surveillance footage. The case became one of Japan's most disturbing domestic murders of 2020, shaking public confidence in urban safety and reviving debates over privacy versus security surveillance. The media dubbed it the Nishinari sisters case. When the trial commenced in 2022, Matsuda showed little emotion. His defense claimed temporary mental disturbance, but the prosecutors countered that his actions, including hiding evidence, returning to clean the crime scene, and fleeing the city, demonstrated full awareness and premeditation. After months of proceedings, the Osaka District Court handed down its verdict: death penalty. The judge described Matsuda's actions as depraved, cruel, and void of humanity, emphasizing the deliberate nature of his crimes and the fear he had instilled, not just in his victims, but in the entire community. Outside the courthouse, Misa broke down in tears as reporters asked for her reaction. She simply said, "I called their names that night. If only they could have answered me." The echo of that unanswered knock remained one of the most haunting details in Japan's modern criminal history, a reminder of how tragedy can unfold silently, just behind a closed door. To visit from China. At first, the sisters saw him as a friendly and generous customer, someone polite who always tipped well and spoke softly. However, over time, subtle changes in Iwasaki's behavior began to emerge. He started showing signs of possessiveness toward Bail and texting her late at night, asking where she was, who she was with, and even waiting outside the restaurant after her shifts ended. When Balin tried to distance herself, he would suddenly appear at places she frequented, pretending the encounters were coincidences. According to her coworkers, Balin had once confided that she felt uncomfortable around Iwasaki, but she was also afraid of offending him, especially since he often acted overly emotional when she rejected his invitations. Eventually, she stopped replying to his messages altogether and avoided the restaurant during his usual visits. That was when his demeanor reportedly changed drastically. He began to threaten her, subtly saying things like, "If you disappear one day, no one here would even notice, or you can't just erase me like that." Coworkers remembered Beolin crying in the staff room one evening after such an encounter. Her sister Bo tried to convince her to report him to the police, but Beolin hesitated, worried that it would cause trouble. Police investigations later found that during this time, Iwasaki had copied a spare key to the sister's apartment. Beolin, trusting him as a friend, had once asked him to help feed her pet fish while she and her sister traveled home during a school break. That small gesture of trust would later prove fatal. On July 5th, the day of the sister's disappearance, Iwasaki was seen on nearby CCTV purchasing plastic rope, duct tape, and cleaning solution from a convenience store near his apartment. The timestamps matched almost perfectly with the timeline established by the footage from the sister's building. When police went to his residence in Ioba Ward, they found the place abandoned. His phone was switched off, and neighbors said he had left hurriedly the morning after the disappearance, carrying 2 large suitcases. For several days, investigators feared another fugitive case similar to the Matsuda murders in Osaka. But fortune turned when a farmer from Shizuoka Prefecture reported an abandoned car parked near a forest trail. Inside the trunk, police found traces of blood and strands of hair. DNA tests confirmed they belonged to Bo and Baol. And the discovery triggered an intensive manhunt across Japan. After 48 hours of coordinated pursuit, Iwasaki was finally arrested at a capsule hotel in Nagoya City. He had dyed his hair and was carrying several fake IDs, along with a small sum of cash. During interrogation, Iwasaki confessed, but his version of events sent chills through the investigators' room. He claimed that he had not intended to kill Bail. According to him, she had belonged to him emotionally, and when she started avoiding him, he just wanted to talk. That night, he used the copied key to enter the apartment, intending to surprise her. But when the older sister confronted him, things escalated. He strangled her in panic, and when Bo returned, he couldn't let her call the police. The following day, he returned with suitcases to remove the bodies, intending to bury them in a remote area. He claimed he did all this while crying. During his trial at the Yokohama District Court, prosecutors emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime: the rope, the cleaning solution, the copied key. Every element pointed to planning, not impulse. His defense pleaded for leniency, arguing emotional instability and obsession, rather than malice. But the judge's verdict was firm. On March 3, 2023, Iwasaki Ruja was sentenced to death. The court described his actions as cold, possessive violence disguised as affection, and the courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. In China, Mr. Chen fainted upon hearing the news. At the memorial service for his daughters, he said in tears, they went abroad to build a future, and were destroyed by someone who called it love. The Yokohama double murder case became one of the most infamous crimes involving foreign students in Japan's modern history. A story of misplaced trust, obsession, and the irreversible price of silence. Located in the Aichi Prefecture, about 260 kilometers west of Tokyo, stood a quiet residential neighborhood known for its safety and suburban calm, a place where crime was almost unheard of. But that peace was shattered in late September 2020, when police discovered what would later be known as one of the most gruesome murder cases in the region's history. The victim was a 24-year-old Vietnamese woman, identified as Pham Thi Tram Mai, who had come to Japan in 2018 under a technical internship program. Like many young Vietnamese workers, she dreamed of saving money to support her parents back home and perhaps open a small business one day. She lived in a modest apartment complex in the city of Tokyo, shared with 2 other Vietnamese interns. Her friends described her as cheerful, hardworking, and always willing to help others. Nothing about her life suggested she would become the center of such a horrific case. On the evening of September 26th, one of her roommates returned home after work and noticed something strange. The lights in Pham's room were off, but the door was slightly ajar. Thinking she might have gone out, the roommate didn't pay much attention. But when morning came and Pham was still nowhere to be seen, her phone left behind on the table, alarm began to set in. Her employer was contacted, and soon the police were notified. Officers arrived at the small apartment at 10:40 a.m. Upon entering, they noticed faint traces of blood on the floor near the bathroom door. Following the trail, they made a grim discovery: a large plastic storage box covered with a blanket. Inside, they found the body of Pham Thi Tramai, wrapped tightly in a black plastic sheet. The scene was horrifying. She had been strangled with a cord, and her body bore signs of a violent struggle. The medical examiner later determined she had died of asphyxiation. Approximately 2 days earlier, the news sent shockwaves through both the local community and Vietnamese social media circles in Japan. Fear spread quickly among foreign workers, especially Vietnamese women living alone. Detectives began piecing together her final hours. According to CCTV footage from a nearby convenience store, Pham had been seen around 8:30 p.m. on September 24th, buying groceries. She appeared calm, even smiling. However, footage from around 9:10 p.m. captured another individual, a young Vietnamese man, wearing a black hoodie and cap, following the same route toward her apartment building. Investigators identified him as Nguyen Van Duc, a 26-year-old fellow Vietnamese national who had previously worked at the same factory as Pham. Witness statements revealed that Duc had shown romantic interest in her, but she had rejected him multiple times. According to factory co-workers, Duc had been seen waiting near Pham's workplace several times, asking about her schedule, and even showing jealousy when she spoke to other men. He reportedly once told a colleague, "If I can't have her, nobody will." A search warrant was issued, and Duc was arrested 3 days later in Nagoya, where he had been hiding at a friend's apartment. When confronted with the evidence, CCTV footage, fingerprints from Pham's apartment, and blood traces on his jacket, Duc broke down and confessed. His statement was chilling in its simplicity. "I went there to talk. She didn't want to see me. I lost control." He admitted that after strangling her, he panicked and attempted to hide the body, staying in the apartment for several hours before wrapping it and placing it in the storage box. He then cleaned the room, took her phone, and fled. During trial, Duc showed little emotion. He claimed it was not murder, insisting he only wanted to stop her from screaming. But prosecutors argued that his actions, purchasing rope in advance and entering with gloves, proved clear premeditation. In August 2022, the Nagoya District Court sentenced Nguyen Van Duc to life imprisonment, stating that his crime was driven by selfish obsession and complete disregard for human dignity. The courtroom was filled with members of Japan's Vietnamese community. Many wept silently as the verdict was read. Outside, one of Pham's close friends told reporters, "She came here to build a better life, and he took everything from her for nothing." The case reignited discussions in Japan about the vulnerability of foreign technical trainees, especially women who live alone and lack local support. For many, Pham's story became not only a symbol of tragedy, but a painful reminder of the loneliness and unseen struggles faced by thousands of migrant workers trying to survive far from home. Fact: their deaths were purely accidental, according to his statement on the day of the incident. He had visited Ballon's apartment to talk about their relationship, which had become increasingly strained in recent months. An argument broke out between the two when Ballon mentioned that she wanted to end things completely and focus on her studies and work. Iwasaki claimed he lost control during the quarrel and pushed her in a moment of anger, causing her to fall and hit her head on the corner of a table. He said she collapsed instantly and never regained consciousness. Panicking, Iwasaki allegedly attempted CPR, but failed. When he realized she was dead, he said he sat motionless for hours, unable to comprehend what had happened. Then, when her younger sister Bizon returned home that evening, He tried to explain what had happened, but she screamed and attempted to flee, fearing that the neighbors might hear and call the police. Iwasaki said he covered her mouth to stop her from shouting, and in the struggle, accidentally suffocated her. However, investigators did not believe Iwasaki's explanation. The autopsy results told a different story. The forensic report revealed that both victims had been strangled manually, with clear bruising patterns consistent with deliberate force. There were also no signs of defensive wounds on either body, suggesting they had been attacked suddenly and overpowered before they could resist. This evidence contradicted Iwasaki's claim of accidental death. In addition, police discovered traces of blood in the bathroom drain and in the apartment hallway, even though the floors appeared to have been meticulously cleaned. Forensic experts concluded that the perpetrator had spent several hours sanitizing the scene, using bleach and cleaning products to remove evidence, further indicating premeditation rather than panic. As public anger intensified, new details about Iwasaki's past began surfacing. Former co-workers described him as quiet but controlling, particularly toward women he dated. One colleague recalled an incident where Iwasaki had become enraged after his girlfriend talked to another man, smashing her phone in jealousy. Others mentioned he often boasted about his deep understanding of Chinese culture and claimed that Chinese women were gentle and easy to control, a statement that later horrified the public when it was reprinted in major newspapers. The prosecution began, constructing a narrative of obsession. Investigators retrieved hundreds of text messages and emails from Iwasaki's phone, many of them sent to Balon during the months before her death. The messages revealed his possessive behavior, alternating between desperate affection and threats. One message read, "If you ever leave me, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Another chilling text, sent just 3 days before the murders, stated, "You can't just throw me away like I'm nothing. I'd rather die than see you with someone else." These findings painted a picture of a man consumed by jealousy and control, unable to accept rejection. Prosecutors argued that when Balin tried to end their relationship, Iwasaki decided that if he couldn't have her, no one would. His decision to wait for her sister's return, they said, proved that he didn't want to leave behind any witnesses who could expose him. When the trial began at the Yokohama District Court, the courtroom was packed with reporters, members of the Chinese community, and grieving relatives. Mr. Chen sat silently in the front row, clutching a framed photo of his daughters. Each time the prosecution described the sequence of events leading to their deaths, he lowered his head, tears silently falling onto his hands. The defense tried to argue for diminished responsibility, claiming that Iwasaki suffered from acute emotional disturbance triggered by heartbreak. But the court-appointed psychological experts refuted this, saying that his careful cleaning of the scene, disposal of bodies, and attempts to deceive investigators demonstrated rational thinking and full awareness of his actions. As the trial went on, the public's outrage grew louder. Outside the courthouse, people gathered with signs demanding the death penalty, shouting that love is no excuse for murder. In both Japan and China, the case reignited discussions about the vulnerability of foreign students, the dangers of toxic relationships, and the responsibilities of host countries to protect international residents. After months of proceedings, the judges finally delivered their verdict. Police detectives dug deeper into the visa angle and found a sliver of truth in Iwasaki's story. Balin's student visa was indeed nearing expiration, and many international students did face desperate choices when their legal status was uncertain. But investigators also found that the sisters had been exploring legitimate options to extend their stay, including additional coursework and part-time positions that might qualify for a change of status. There was no credible evidence. They had planned a staged disappearance, and nothing, no messages, no planning notes, no corroborating witness supported the bizarre claim that they had willingly crawled into suitcases. Instead, the weight of the forensic and digital evidence painted a very different picture. repeated stalking, possessive messages, pre-purchase of supplies used to conceal a crime, surveillance footage showing the suspect's comings and goings, and the bloody traces in his car and apartment. Taken together, the materials showed planning, concealment, and an effort to evade detection, not a botched cooperative plan dreamed up by the victims themselves. When the case went to trial, prosecutors framed it as a textbook sequence of obsessive violence that escalated into murder. They detailed Iwasaki's long pattern of controlling behavior, the timing of his purchases and movements, and the meticulous attempts to clean and hide evidence. The defense tried to recast the story as tragedy born of misunderstanding and emotional collapse, but their narrative could not withstand the physical proof and the clear inconsistencies in Iwasaki's statements. Public reaction remained fierce and profoundly sorrowful. Community vigils in Yokohama and messages from China filled social feeds and news sites. The Chen family, who had flown to Japan for the proceedings and the funerals, pleaded that the court remembered their daughters as bright, hard-working young women, not as victims reduced to a sensational headline. In the courtroom, Mr. Chen's grief was visible and raw as he read a victim impact statement, describing the hopes he had for his girls and the irreparable void their deaths had left behind. On the day the sentence was announced, the judge condemned the defendant's acts as deliberate and cruel, emphasizing that the murders were not the result of an accidental scuffle, but of calculated violence and concealment. Iwasaki Ruja was convicted of multiple counts, including murder and unlawful disposal of remains, and handed one of Japan's harshest punishments. Appeals were later denied, and the sentence stood in the aftermath. The case left broader ripples, renewed calls for better protections for international students, more accessible reporting channels for harassment, and improved support networks so vulnerable residents would not be isolated when threatened. For the Chen family, no sentence could restore what was lost. They returned home, carrying a grief that communities on both sides of the sea would not soon forget. After the High Court ordered a retrial, the Yokohama District Court reopened the proceedings in July 2021, 2 years after the brutal murders of the Chen sisters. During this new trial, defendant Iwasaki Ruya remained defiant, once again proclaiming his innocence and refusing to answer most questions posed by the court. His silence and lack of cooperation only deepened public outrage, as many interpreted his demeanor as cold and remorseless, rather than as a sign of restraint. The prosecution, however, made a significant adjustment to its strategy. While it no longer sought the death penalty, as in the first trial, it argued firmly for a life sentence, emphasizing that the nature of the crime, the calculated killing of 2 defenseless young women, warranted the harshest punishment short of execution. Prosecutors highlighted Iwasaki's deliberate preparation, his attempts to clean and conceal evidence, and the emotional devastation inflicted on the victim's family and wider community. They contended that the original 23-year sentence grossly underestimated the brutality and premeditation of the acts, and that the district court's earlier focus on the absence of sharp weapons as a mitigating factor was deeply flawed. A weapon is not only defined by its blade, the prosecution stated. In this case, the perpetrator's method, strangulation, confinement, and disposal was equally cruel, calculated, and lethal. The retrial drew widespread media coverage across Japan and China, reigniting debates about the leniency of Japan's sentencing system and the challenges of securing capital punishment even in severe homicide cases. Members of the public, especially within the Chinese expatriate community, closely followed the proceedings and expressed hope that the retrial would finally deliver justice worthy of the victim's suffering. As the retrial progressed, the court once again examined every crucial piece of evidence, from surveillance footage and forensic results to the suspect's phone records and the timeline of events. The prosecution argued that Iwasaki's actions showed clear premeditation and that he had intentionally taken advantage of the sisters' trust before betraying them in the most horrific way. His attempts to disguise the crime as a planned disappearance and his refusal to accept responsibility, they said, demonstrated a complete absence of remorse. Witnesses, including colleagues and acquaintances of Baolin and Baoshin, testified again. Several described how Iwasaki had displayed obsessive and possessive behavior toward Baolin in the months leading up to the murders. Others mentioned that she had tried to distance herself from him, possibly prompting his violent outburst. Each testimony painted a clearer picture of a man consumed by resentment and jealousy, one who could not accept rejection. In contrast, the defense team maintained its previous stance, that Iwasaki had only intended to help the sisters and had not killed them. They repeated the far-fetched claim that the victims had voluntarily entered the suitcases as part of a fake disappearance plan. However, the judges were unmoved. Forensic evidence, including injuries inconsistent with voluntary confinement and traces of DNA and blood in Iwasaki's car, completely refuted that narrative. After several weeks of hearings, the Yokohama District Court delivered its final verdict. The judges concluded that Iwasaki Ruja had deliberately murdered both sisters out of anger and possessiveness, and afterward attempted to cover up his crime in a calculated manner. The court described the killings as cruel, inhumane, and motivated by selfish obsession. While the prosecution had withdrawn its request for the death penalty, the court agreed that the previous 23-year sentence had been unreasonably lenient. In their final decision, the judges increased the punishment to life imprisonment, stating that Iwasaki's actions had irreparably destroyed 2 innocent lives and caused immense grief to their family and the wider public. When the verdict was read, Mr. Chen, the sisters' father, wept openly in the courtroom. Through an interpreter, he addressed the court, saying, "My daughters came to Japan with dreams and hopes. They were kind and hard-working. I will never forgive the man who took them from me, but today, I hope their souls can finally rest." Outside the courthouse, many people gathered with flowers and photos of the 2 sisters. Although some still felt that even a life sentence could not truly reflect the magnitude of the tragedy, others believed that at last, justice, though delayed, had been served. Infants. With the cabin secured, the crew prepared for departure. The atmosphere in the cockpit was calm and professional as Captain Bavi Suneja and First Officer Harvino went through the final items of their pre-flight checklist. The aircraft, a Boeing 737 MAX-8, stood ready on the tarmac of Soekarno-Hatta International Airport in Jakarta, gleaming under the pale morning light. The engines roared to life as the pilots received clearance for takeoff. At 6:20 a.m., Flight JT610 began its journey toward Dapati Amir Airport in Pangkal Penang, a flight expected to last roughly an hour and 20 minutes. As the jet lifted gracefully into the air, everything appeared normal. The cabin crew began their routine safety demonstrations, while passengers settled into their seats, some glancing out the windows at the receding city skyline. But just minutes after takeoff, things began to go terribly wrong. The master warning lights suddenly illuminated in a harsh red glow, the very light pilots dread most. Simultaneously, the aircraft's stick shaker began vibrating violently, warning of an imminent stall, even though the plane was climbing normally. Inside the cockpit, confusion mounted. The flight instruments on the captain's side displayed incorrect readings, showing a dangerously low airspeed and altitude, while the first officer's instruments appeared normal. The pilots quickly realized they were dealing with conflicting sensor data, a nightmare scenario for any flight crew. Captain Suneya and First Officer Harvino struggled to make sense of the situation, cross-checking their instruments while trying to maintain control of the aircraft. As they attempted to stabilize the plane, the autopilot suddenly disengaged, and the aircraft's nose began pitching downward. Unbeknownst to them, A malfunctioning angle of attack sensor had triggered the aircraft's newly installed MCA's system. Maneuvering characteristics, augmentation system, an automated program, designed to push the nose down if the plane was in danger of stalling. But in this case, the system was acting on faulty data, repeatedly forcing the aircraft's nose toward the sea. The pilots fought back with all their strength, pulling on the control column to bring the nose up, only for the MCAs to activate again, pushing it down once more. This deadly tug-of-war continued over and over, 26 times in total, as the jet climbed and dove erratically. Inside the cabin, passengers felt sudden drops and jolts, some screaming as drinks and luggage were thrown from their compartments. Captain Tsunaja radioed air traffic control, requesting permission to return to Jakarta, reporting flight control problems. Permission was immediately granted. Yet despite their efforts, the situation worsened. The control columns grew heavier, the alarms louder. The master warning light, still flashing red, illuminated the cockpit in an eerie glow as the pilots fought for their lives and the lives of everyone on board. At 6:32 a.m., just 13 minutes after takeoff, radar contact with Flight 610 was lost. The Boeing 737 MAX plunged into the Java Sea at a speed of over 700 kilometers per hour, disintegrating upon impact. All 189 people on board, passengers and crew, perished in the crash. Silence fell inside the cockpit, broken only by the blaring alarms and the strained breathing of the two pilots fighting for control. The Boeing 737 MAX, now in a terrifying dive, was descending at over 3,000 feet per minute. Captain Tsuneya gripped the control column with both hands, pulling back with all his strength, while First Officer Harvino frantically attempted to stabilize the trim using manual switches. But no matter what they did, the nose kept pushing downward, as if something invisible was fighting against them. Jakarta, Lion Air 610, flight control problem. Request vector to return immediately. The captain's voice crackled through the radio. His tone was urgent, almost trembling, but still controlled, the mark of a professional trying to save 189 lives. Air traffic control immediately responded. Lion Air 610, Roger, radar contact, proceed to return to Jakarta. But the pilots were battling an unseen enemy, the MCAS system maneuvering characteristics augmentation system, an automated software installed on the new Boeing 737 MAX series. It had been designed to prevent the plane from stalling, but when fed incorrect sensor data, it could force the nose downward automatically, even when pilots tried to pull it up. Unaware of this hidden software's full function, Captain Su and First Officer Harvino found themselves trapped in a deadly loop. Every few seconds, the MCA's system would trigger again, trimming the nose down, sending the aircraft into another dive. The pilots would manually pull it back up, only for the system to push it down again. Inside the cabin, passengers began to scream as the aircraft lurched violently up and down. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Flight attendants tried desperately to calm the chaos, but fear had already consumed the cabin. At 6:31 a.m., Flight 610 was flying erratically over the Java Sea, its altitude fluctuating wildly between 2,000 and 5,000 feet. The ground proximity alarm blared, "Don't sink, don't sink," a chilling warning that the sea was closing in fast. "Flaps 1 degree, try stabilizer cutout," shouted First Officer Harvino, recalling a last resort procedure from his memory. Captain Tsunaja followed, cutting power to the automatic stabilizer trim switches in a desperate attempt to stop the nose-down commands. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. The nose steadied, the alarms quieted, and hope flickered. But seconds later, the pilots unknowingly reactivated the system while trying to retrim the aircraft, allowing MCAs to seize control once more. At 6:32 a.m., the Boeing 737 MAX entered a final unrecoverable dive, traveling at nearly 450 knots. The aircraft plunged straight into the Java Sea. The impact disintegrated the jet instantly. All 189 souls on board, passengers, crew, and pilots were lost, part of the elite diving unit assisting in the retrieval efforts. His death underscored the immense difficulty and danger of the mission. The waters of the Java Sea were unpredictable, and the debris field extended over several nautical miles. Despite these obstacles, the team pressed on, determined to recover every fragment of the ill-fated flight. Days turned into weeks as search operations continued. Families of the victims gathered along the coast, lighting candles, holding photos, and praying for closure. For them, the discovery of even the smallest piece of wreckage carried profound emotional weight. Each recovered fragment told a part of the story, a story they needed to hear, no matter how painful. By January 2019, after months of relentless work, divers finally located the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, buried under layers of seabed sediment, nearly 32 meters below the surface. The recorder, though damaged, was carefully retrieved and handed over to Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee KNKT for analysis. The contents of the black boxes painted a chilling picture. Data from the flight data recorder revealed that the plane's angle of attack sensor had been feeding incorrect readings to the aircraft's computers from the moment it took off. The sensor falsely indicated that the plane's nose was too high, prompting the MCAS system to push the nose downward repeatedly to prevent a supposed stall. The cockpit voice recordings captured the tense final minutes. The two pilots, realizing something was terribly wrong, fought valiantly to regain control. Their voices grew increasingly strained as the system kept forcing the aircraft down. The last words recorded were those of First Officer Harvino, calling out, "Altitude dropping. Captain, we're going down," followed by the sound of impact. The investigation would soon uncover the shocking truth. The MCA's system, a new automated safety feature installed by Boeing, had not been fully disclosed to many pilots or airlines. The software's behavior, especially its ability to override manual inputs based on a single sensor, was not explained in training materials. This omission would prove catastrophic, not just for Flight 610, but for the world's aviation industry. The revelation of Boeing's MCAS system sparked an international uproar. Aviation experts, regulators, and pilots across the world were stunned to learn that a critical system capable of overriding pilot commands had been barely mentioned in the aircraft's manual. Even seasoned captains, who had thousands of hours on Boeing 737 models, admitted they had never heard of MCAS before the crash. The Indonesian investigation team released its preliminary report in November 2018, just weeks after the disaster. It revealed that the angle of attack, AOA sensor on the plane's left side, had provided false data shortly after takeoff, triggering the MCAs repeatedly. Each time the pilots tried to pull the nose up, the system pushed it down again. This tug-of-war continued more than 20 times in just 13 minutes, before the plane finally plunged into the sea. When questioned, Boeing initially maintained that the 737 MAX was safe and airworthy. The company stated that proper procedures could prevent such a crash, implying pilot error. However, leaked internal emails and testimonies later showed that even Boeing engineers had raised serious concerns about the MCAS system during development. Some messages included statements like, "This airplane is designed by clowns, who in turn are supervised by monkeys." Public outrage grew when details emerged about Boeing's decision to downplay MCA's training to make the new 737 MAX more appealing to airlines. Boeing promised that pilots already trained on older 737s wouldn't need expensive simulator retraining, a decision that saved airlines millions but came at a devastating cost. Then, in March 2019, tragedy struck again. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, another Boeing 737 MAX, crashed just 6 minutes after takeoff. killing all 157 people on board. The similarities between the two crashes were undeniable. Both jets had received faulty sensor data, and both were forced into fatal nosedives by the MCAS system. The world reacted swiftly. Within days, aviation authorities across the globe grounded all Boeing 737 MAX aircraft. It became one of the largest groundings in aviation history. The United States, initially reluctant, eventually followed suit after mounting pressure and damning evidence. As investigations deepened, Boeing faced severe backlash from families, pilots, and regulators. The U.S. Congress launched hearings, where grieving relatives held photos of their loved ones and demanded justice. Boeing's CEO at the time, Dennis Muilenburg, was grilled by lawmakers and forced to admit that mistakes had been made, yet his testimony was widely criticized for lacking empathy. In the months that followed, Boeing's reputation plummeted. Airlines canceled orders, the company's stock nosedived, and production of the 737 MAX was temporarily halted. Internally, Boeing engineers worked feverishly to redesign the MCAS system, ensuring that it could no longer rely on a single sensor and that pilots would retain full control in case of system failure. By late 2020, after nearly 2 years of investigations, updates, and recertifications, the Boeing 737 MAX was cleared to fly again, but the shadow of the tragedies lingered. Families of the victims continued to fight for accountability, filing lawsuits and demanding transparency. The Lion Air Flight 610 disaster became more than just a plane crash. It became a symbol of how corporate negligence, cost-cutting, and complacency could converge to cause unimaginable loss. In the wake of the Lion Air Flight 610 tragedy, followed by the Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crash, the aviation world was shaken to its core. Investigators from multiple countries, united in their mission to uncover the full extent of responsibility behind the deaths of 346 people. What emerged was a disturbing web of negligence, cost, and corporate deception that stretched from the assembly lines in Seattle to the executive boardrooms of Boeing. Families of the victims demanded justice. In Jakarta, hundreds gathered in silent vigils along the coast where debris from Flight 610 had washed ashore. Parents, spouses, and children held framed photographs, clutching them tightly as they wept. For them, the pain wasn't just from losing loved ones, it was from knowing the crash could have been prevented. As investigations unfolded, Boeing's internal practices came under intense scrutiny. It was revealed that the company had deliberately downplayed the significance of the MCAS system to both regulators and airlines. In a bid to compete with Airbus's new A320neo, a fuel-efficient rival, Boeing had rushed the 737 MAX into service. The MCAS was introduced to compensate for the plane's new, larger engines, which altered its aerodynamics. However, rather than being transparent about the new system, Boeing chose to minimize it, describing it as a minor, software enhancement that didn't require special pilot training. Emails and documents later uncovered by the U.S. House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure showed Boeing employees mocking regulators and joking about deceiving customers. One chilling email read, "I still haven't been forgiven by God for the covering up I did last year." In January 2021, Boeing reached a $2.5 billion settlement with the U.S. Department of Justice. The agreement included $243 million in criminal penalties, $1.77 billion in compensation to airlines, and $500 million for the victims' families. However, Boeing avoided criminal prosecution by admitting that 2 of its technical pilots had misled the FAA during certification. For many families, this outcome felt like a slap on the wrist. They knew the plane was unsafe, said one victim's mother during a press conference. They gambled with our loved ones' lives and called it business. In Indonesia, Lion Air also faced public criticism. Reports revealed that the plane involved in Flight 610 had experienced the same sensor issue the night before the crash. but was still cleared for flight the next morning. Questions were raised about the airline's maintenance, procedures, and the decision to continue operating the aircraft despite repeated complaints from previous crews. International aviation authorities also faced their reckoning. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, which had allowed Boeing to self-certify many of its systems, was accused of failing in its oversight responsibilities. The FAA later admitted that it had placed too much trust in Boeing during the certification process. As legal battles continued across multiple countries, Boeing's leadership changed. CEO Dennis Muhlenberg was ousted, and the company pledged to rebuild its culture around safety and transparency. Boeing's new CEO, David Calhoun, publicly apologized to the families, stating, "We are deeply sorry for the loss of lives in these accidents. We can and must do better, and we will." Despite the apology, for many families, the words meant little. Some refused compensation, instead demanding full accountability and criminal charges against those responsible. Memorials were built in both Indonesia and Ethiopia, honoring the victims whose lives were cut short by corporate failure. By 2023, the Boeing 737 MAX had returned to service worldwide, flying millions of passengers safely each year. Yet, for those who lost loved ones, every mention of the 737 MAX served as a haunting reminder of what went wrong. The Lion Air tragedy stands today as a stark lesson in aviation history, a reminder that even the most advanced machines are only as safe as the integrity of the people who design, approve, and operate them. On March 10, 2019, disaster struck once more when another Boeing 737 MAX, this time operated by Ethiopian Airlines, crashed to the ground just minutes after taking off from Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. In mere moments, all 157 passengers and crew members on board lost their lives, plunging families and nations into grief and reigniting global fears. Surrounding the aircraft's safety, this second catastrophe, occurring less than 5 months after the Lion Air tragedy, served as a devastating confirmation that the problems with the 737 MAX were far from isolated. The similarities between both crashes were chilling. The same erratic flight behavior, the same struggle by pilots to control a downward pitching aircraft, and the same failure of the MCA's maneuvering characteristics augmentation system. The loss triggered an international outcry. Aviation authorities and airlines across the globe swiftly grounded every Boeing 737 MAX in operation, marking one of the most extensive safety groundings in modern aviation history. Investigations were launched in multiple countries, and Boeing, once synonymous with reliability, found itself under intense scrutiny from regulators, pilots, and the public. Certificate, and dreamed of opening his own repair shop one day. Adalbert, Marcus's cousin, was known to be easygoing and hardworking, having recently moved to Clear Lake. He was eager to start fresh and had been helping Marcus's stepfather with small construction projects while exploring local job opportunities. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community. How could 4 young people with such promising futures be gunned down in what appeared to be a senseless act of violence? Detectives from the Harris County Sheriff's Office were immediately brought in to handle the case, and from the outset, they faced intense public pressure to find answers. Investigators began combing through the crime scene for any trace of evidence. They found multiple sets of fingerprints, several shell casings, and blood patterns suggesting at least 2 shooters had moved through the living room in a matter of seconds. Nothing appeared stolen. No valuables, no electronics, not even wallets, indicating that robbery was not the motive. Witnesses from nearby homes reported hearing a series of loud pops shortly after 3:30 p.m., followed by the sound of a car speeding away. However, no one saw the shooters clearly. The randomness of the violence and lack of a clear motive frustrated detectives. Over the next several weeks, police interviewed dozens of friends and acquaintances. Rumors began to swirl. Some said the murders were connected to drugs. Others whispered about jealous ex-boyfriends or a debt gone wrong. Yet none of the leads panned out. The case soon grew cold. Months turned into years, and although investigators had DNA evidence and ballistics, they lacked a suspect to tie it to. The victims' families were left in agony, haunted by the unanswered question: who could have done this, and why? Christine's mother recalled that her daughter often spoke fondly of Rachel and Tiffany, describing them as warm, protective, and full of life. She said, Christine would come home smiling when she spent time with those girls. She told me how kind they were, how they made her feel normal, like she finally belonged somewhere. The friendship between the three young women had started as a genuine bond, but over time, something changed. After high school, Christine's life began to spiral downward. She fell in with a rough crowd, began using drugs, and drifted further away from the friends who once cared for her. Her mother said Christine had struggled with feelings of rejection and anger as her addiction worsened. By the time police received the Crime Stoppers tip in 2006, Christine had been in and out of rehab several times. The mention of her ex-boyfriend, Chris, caught investigators' attention immediately. Detectives began digging into her background and discovered that her boyfriend at the time of the murders was Christopher Snyder, a 21-year-old with a long history of violent behavior, drug use, and erratic outbursts. When police compared the old witness descriptions from 2003, a young man and woman dressed in black seen walking near Tiffany's house that afternoon, the similarities were striking. Christine's features matched the sketch almost perfectly. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together. Detectives tracked down Christine and brought her in for questioning. After hours of intense interrogation, she finally broke down. Through tears, she confessed to being present during the murders, but she insisted that Snyder was the one who pulled the trigger. Christine's confession began hesitantly. Her voice trembled as she spoke, sometimes stopping mid-sentence, as though reliving the horror in her mind. Detectives listened intently, recording every word. She told them that in the weeks leading up to the murders, her relationship with Christopher Snyder had become increasingly violent and unstable. Snyder was controlling, paranoid, and often high on meth or cocaine. He carried guns everywhere and bragged about not being afraid to use them. According to Christine, he had developed a fixation on Tiffany, convinced that Tiffany had been spreading rumors about him and mocking Christine behind her back. Christine claimed that on July 18, 2003, Snyder had shown up at her apartment in a rage. He had been drinking heavily, ranting about wanting to teach those girls a lesson. She tried to calm him down, but he shoved a gun into her hands and told her she was coming with him. Terrified, she went along, too afraid to resist. That afternoon, the pair drove to Tiffany's house in a black Mazda. Snyder parked a few houses away. Christine remembered sitting in the passenger seat, her stomach turning as he loaded the weapons, a 9mm pistol and a .38 caliber revolver. When she begged him to stop, he sneered and said, "You're in this with me now." They approached the house quietly. The TV was on inside. Laughter could be heard from the living room. Tiffany, Rachel, Marcus, and Adelbert were all just relaxing, completely unaware of the danger at their door. Snyder pushed open the unlocked front door, and everything happened in a blur. He raised his gun and opened fire without a word. Tiffany and Adelbert were hit first. Marcus jumped up, trying to shield Tiffany, but was gunned down immediately. Rachel screamed and tried to reach her phone, dialing 911 before Snyder struck her in the head with the butt of his gun. Christine said she froze as the shots kept echoing, deafening and endless. When it was over, Snyder stood there breathing heavily, surrounded by blood and silence. He looked at Christine and said coldly, "Now they can't laugh at you anymore." Christine told detectives that Snyder then dragged her out of the house, threatening to kill her if she ever spoke about what happened. For the next few years, she lived in fear, haunted by nightmares and addiction. She said she finally decided to tell the truth after Snyder left her and she checked into rehab. Once her confession was complete, police immediately issued a warrant for Christopher Snyder's arrest. But when officers arrived at his residence in Delaware, Ohio, they were too late. Snyder had barricaded himself inside his home. After a tense standoff lasting several hours, he turned his gun on himself, ending his life before he could be captured. Christine was arrested and charged with capital murder in 2008. After a lengthy trial, she was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the families of Tiffany, Rachel, Marcus, and Adelbert, justice had finally arrived, though it could never erase the pain of what they had lost. Christine continued her account, her voice faltering as she tried to piece together what had happened that afternoon. "He took me over to your homegirl's house," she began, referring to Tiffany's residence. "He said he wanted to see if Marcus was there, so I drove him over, and he got out of the car. He told me to drive around the block, just drive. So I did." She paused, fidgeting with her hands before continuing. "When I came back, he was walking from the opposite direction, away from the house. He just got in the car real quick and told me to keep driving. He looked different, sweaty, tense. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a bag of drugs." Christine said she initially thought he had simply managed to score from Marcus or someone at the house. "I thought he hooked up a deal or something," she said softly. "But then I started thinking, he didn't even have enough money for what was in that bag. That's when I knew something wasn't right." The detective leaned forward, pressing gently. "Christine, what did he say next?" She hesitated, tears forming in her eyes. "He just laughed, like nothing happened. And when I asked him where he got the drugs, he said, 'Don't worry about it. They won't be needing them anymore.'" At that moment, detectives exchanged glances. Christine's story aligned with evidence from the crime scene. Drugs and cash had been left untouched, suggesting robbery wasn't the motive. But her claim of not knowing what Snyder had done until afterward didn't fit with other details. When investigators confronted her with inconsistencies, like the witness descriptions of two people entering the house, Christine broke down further. "I didn't want to go in," she cried. "He made me. I was scared of him. I didn't shoot anyone. I swear I didn't. He said if I told anyone, he'd kill me too." Detectives listened in silence, weighing her every word. They could sense the mix of guilt, fear, and denial in her voice. She had admitted enough to place herself at the scene, but still tried to distance herself from the actual killings. From there, police worked to verify her story, tracing Snyder's movements, interviewing witnesses, and collecting evidence. Slowly but surely, the full picture of that horrific afternoon began to emerge. "For what was in that bag," she said. "So I started thinking wait a minute, where did he get all that?" Christine told detectives that, after they left, Chris was jittery, breathing heavily, and refused to talk about what had happened inside. He allegedly told her to just keep driving and don't ask questions. She claimed she didn't know that anyone had been hurt until later that evening when she saw a breaking news report about 3 bodies found in a home in Clear Lake. Detectives, however, weren't convinced. Her tone was detached, her answers rehearsed. They had already gathered enough physical and digital evidence to know that Christine's story didn't add up. Phone records placed her inside the house around the time of the murders. DNA found on duct tape and a pair of gloves at the scene also matched hers. When detectives confronted her with this, Christine's calm exterior began to crack. Her voice wavered, and she started crying. He told me they had money, okay?" she said through tears. "He said we were just going to scare them, that nobody was going to get hurt." The detective leaned forward. "But Christine, they weren't just scared, were they?" They were executed. Christine lowered her head and said nothing. The silence stretched for several minutes before she finally whispered, "I didn't mean for it to go that far." From that point, her story changed several times. In one version, she claimed she stayed outside the whole time. In another, she admitted going in, but insisted she didn't pull the trigger. Eventually, she said that things got out of control when Chris started arguing with Marcus over drugs and money. According to Christine, the situation turned violent in seconds. "He just snapped," she said. "He started yelling, waving the gun around, and then, it just happened. I was screaming at him to stop." Investigators later determined that all three victims, Rachel, Tiffany, and Marcus, had been shot execution style. The evidence suggested more than one person was involved, meaning Christine's claims of being a bystander were highly doubtful. Chris was arrested 2 days later after a brief manhunt that ended in a dramatic standoff at a friend's apartment. When he was finally taken into custody, police found him armed, high, and incoherent. During interrogation, Chris gave his own version of events, one that placed the majority of the blame squarely on Christine. He claimed she had been the one who knew the victims. She had been the one who suggested the robbery, and she had fired the first shot, with both of their stories conflicting and physical evidence. Linking them both to the crime scene, investigators began piecing together a timeline of what really happened that tragic day in Clear Lake. Detectives spent weeks sifting through every detail of that day, reconstructing the events minute by minute. What they uncovered painted a far darker picture than either Christine or Chris had admitted. On the morning of the murders, Christine had reportedly reached out to Tiffany, asking if she and Rachel were home. Tiffany, unsuspecting, said yes and invited her over. Christine told her she'd be coming by with a friend to hang out and maybe buy some weed from Marcus, who was known to deal small amounts. Surveillance cameras from nearby streets later showed Christine's car pulling into the neighborhood around 3:15 p.m. Witnesses recalled hearing loud voices, an argument shortly after the car arrived. Then, minutes later, a series of gunshots. According to the forensic timeline, the attack was quick and brutal. Marcus was shot first, likely during a confrontation in the living room. Tiffany was found near the hallway, suggesting she tried to run. Rachel was discovered in the bedroom, where she may have been hiding or pleading for her life. Each had been shot multiple times. Detectives also discovered that Christine and Chris had taken several items from the house: cash, drugs, and jewelry. But what disturbed investigators most was that Christine had known these victims for years. She had been one of their closest friends. In the following days, Christine and Chris fled Clear Lake and began a downward spiral that lasted nearly a year. They bounced between motels, living off the stolen money and Christine's inheritance, until their arrest in San Antonio. Prosecutors later revealed that Christine had been the mastermind behind the robbery. Messages retrieved from her phone showed her discussing the plan days in advance. In one chilling text to Chris, she wrote, "They've got money and weed. We go in, grab what we can, and get out. Easy." But it was anything but easy. During the trial, the courtroom listened to heartbreaking testimony from the victims' families. Rachel's father broke down when recalling how his daughter had once protected Christine from bullies, only for that same girl to be the reason she died. Christine's defense argued that she was manipulated and abused by Chris, that her drug addiction clouded her judgment, and that she never intended for anyone to die. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours before finding her guilty of capital murder. Chris received the same verdict. Both were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the sentence was read, Christine showed no visible reaction, just sat still, eyes empty. But as she was led out of the courtroom, she turned to her mother and whispered, "I'm sorry." Lori later said in an interview that she didn't believe her daughter truly understood what she had done. Christine died long before that trial, she said. The drugs, the pain, the people she surrounded herself with. They took her away from us, years before she took those lives. The Clear Lake murders would go down as one of the most shocking cases in Texas history, not just because of the brutality, but because of the betrayal that lay at its heart. A girl killing the very friends who once gave her the confidence to live again. The police asked to open. Inside, they found 2 handguns, several rounds of ammunition, and a small bag of jewelry items that would soon prove crucial to the case. When forensic teams processed the weapons, one of the handguns matched the ballistics of the bullets recovered from the victims at the Clear Lake home. It was the final piece linking Chris Snyder directly to the murders. But investigators also noticed something else in that safe, a folded piece of paper with Christine's name written across it in black ink. Inside were a few of her personal items, a ring, a Polaroid of the 2 of them, and a letter scrawled in Chris's messy handwriting. It read, "We did what we had to do. I'll never forget you. Don't talk. Ever. They'll never understand us." The evidence was damning. Both were now implicated, and the theory that Christine had merely been a bystander no longer held up. Days later, on July 22nd, police finally tracked Chris down. He had fled to his parents' rural property outside Clear Lake after hearing Christine had been arrested. When officers arrived, they surrounded the small house and ordered him to come out. For over 2 hours, Chris refused to surrender, pacing between windows and shouting incoherently. Then, suddenly, a single gunshot rang out from inside. When police entered, they found Chris Snyder dead from a self-inflicted wound. He had shot himself with the same gun used in the murders. News of Chris's suicide quickly reached Christine, who was still in custody at the Houston jail. When detectives told her, she broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably and repeating, "He promised he wouldn't leave me." But for investigators, his death was closure of a sort. They now had both suspects accounted for, the murder weapon recovered, and enough forensic evidence to move forward. The prosecution of Christine Palila would go on without him in the following weeks. The police reconstructed the crime scene using her own statements, witness testimony, and forensics. It became clear that she hadn't just been there, she had been an active participant. The claim that Chris's hand was over hers when the gun went off didn't align with the trajectory of the bullets, the multiple gunshots, or the physical evidence showing both victims had been shot execution-style. By late 2007, the case was ready to go to trial. The story that once began as a tragic tale of a bullied girl who finally found acceptance had turned into something far darker, a descent into jealousy, drugs, and murder. Christine Palila's trial began in October 2008 in a packed Houston courtroom. The case had drawn national attention by then, not just because of the brutality of the murders, but because of who Christine had once been, the shy, bullied girl with alopecia who'd been crowned Miss Irresistible in high school. The transformation from victim to killer was something that left even seasoned journalists stunned. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They described the crime as cold-blooded and deliberate, committed out of jealousy, greed, and a deep-seated resentment. According to them, Christine hadn't been dragged into this by Chris Snyder. She was the mastermind. Assistant District Attorney Tracy Bennett told the jury. Christine Palila wanted what her friends had, their beauty, their confidence, their freedom. When she couldn't have it, she destroyed it. The prosecution presented physical evidence linking her directly to the scene. Her fingerprints on a bottle found in the living room, traces of her DNA on a cigarette butt near one of the bodies, and most importantly, eyewitness testimony that placed her and Chris in the area at the exact time of the murders. Then came the photos. The jury was shown images from the scene, the 4 young victims, all shot multiple times, their bodies lying among scattered belongings and pools of blood. The room fell silent. Even Christine avoided looking up. Trembling, as the images were displayed on the screen. But perhaps the most damning evidence was her own confession. Prosecutors played excerpts from her taped interviews, including the one from the hospital where she admitted that the gun went off in her hand. In another segment, she could be heard saying she was freaking out because they knew me. The defense tried to paint a different picture. Christine's attorney argued that she was a broken young woman manipulated by a much older, abusive boyfriend. They described her as a victim of coercion and addiction, someone whose life had spiraled out of control after years of trauma, bullying, and substance abuse. Her lawyer told the jury. Christine was under the spell of a dangerous man. She was not in control. She was terrified, addicted, and emotionally dependent. Chris Snyder used her. To reinforce this narrative, the defense brought up her childhood struggles, the alopecia that had made her the target of cruel jokes, the glasses, the wigs, the isolation. They even brought in a psychologist who testified that Christine suffered from borderline personality disorder and post-traumatic stress. But the prosecution countered sharply, pointing out inconsistencies in her story. If she had been so terrified of Chris, why had she stayed with him after the murders? Why hadn't she gone to the police once he was dead? Why had she continued to lie repeatedly until the physical evidence forced her to confess? The jury listened intently for 2 weeks as both sides battled it out. Christine herself eventually took the stand. Dressed in a plain beige sweater, her hair grown back short, she spoke softly, often crying as she recounted the events. She insisted she had never meant for anyone to die, that she had been manipulated, drugged, and scared. But under cross-examination, her composure broke. When asked by the prosecutor, "If you loved your friend so much, why did you go back to that house armed with guns?" Christine paused for several seconds, her voice barely audible when she answered, "I don't know. I wish I never did." After days of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. On October 13, 2008, Christine Paulila was found guilty on 4 counts of capital murder. Because she was only 17 at the time of the killings, the state could not pursue the death penalty. Instead, she was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 40 years. As the judge read the sentence, Christine wept silently. Behind her, the families of the 4 victims sat together, some crying, others stone-faced. Rachel's father, George, later said, "We lost 4 beautiful souls that day. Nothing brings them back, but at least now we have justice." Christine was led out of the courtroom in shackles, her head bowed. He said, "I don't think there's a day that goes by that we don't think about it, about what she did and how it all happened. None of us saw it coming. Christine was our daughter, our little girl, and to know she was capable of this, it breaks us every single day." For the families of the victims, the verdict brought justice, but never peace. Many of them spoke about the lifelong pain the murders had left behind. Tiffany's mother, Linda, said in a statement to the press, "We don't celebrate today. There's no happiness in this. We just finally got a little bit of closure. Our children are never coming back." Over the years that followed, Christine remained behind bars at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas, the same facility that houses some of the state's most infamous female inmates. By all reports, she spent much of her early time in prison, isolated and quiet, often requesting counseling and medication for depression. In 2015, over a decade after her conviction, Christine gave a rare on-camera interview from prison for a documentary. For the first time, she spoke publicly about what happened that day. She claimed that she and Chris Snyder had gone to the house only to buy drugs, and that the situation spiraled out of control. She said, "I remember the gunshots. I remember screaming. I remember the blood. But it's all flashes. Sometimes I don't know what's real anymore. I never meant for anyone to die." But when the interviewer pressed her about Justin's testimony, her alleged admission that she had beaten Rachel to death, Christine shook her head. "I never did that," she said firmly. "I would never hurt Rachel. I loved her." Her words, however, did little to sway public opinion. Many who watched the documentary felt she was still deflecting blame, still trapped in denial. Investigators, too, stood by their belief that Christine was equally responsible. As SGT Brian Harris put it, "We don't believe she was an innocent bystander. We believe she wanted revenge. She wanted to be seen. And that day, she made sure no one else would shine brighter than her." Christine's attempts to appeal her conviction have continued through the years, citing her addiction, mental health, and claims of an unfair trial. But each time, the courts have rejected her petitions. The latest appeal, filed in 2022, was dismissed without hearing. Today, Christine Palila remains incarcerated, serving her life sentence. She will be eligible for parole in 2046, when she turns 60. Until then, she will continue to live with the label that has followed her since her arrest, the Clear Lake Killer. For the families of Tiffany, Rachel, Marcus, and Adelbert, time has not healed the wound. Every year, they gather privately to honor their children's memories, for young lives full of potential, lost to senseless violence. As Rachel's father once said during a vigil, holding a framed photo of his daughter under the candlelight, "They were all just kids. They laughed, they dreamed, they trusted the wrong person. And for that, they paid with their lives." That's something none of us will ever forget. In the years following the trial, the Clear Lake case continued to haunt the community, a reminder of how quickly trust can turn deadly. Many locals still remember the headlines and the fear that gripped the quiet suburban neighborhood after the murders. The once bustling street where Tiffany lived became eerily quiet, and for a long time, no one wanted to move into the house where it all happened. It stood vacant for several years before eventually being renovated and sold, though neighbors say few have stayed there for long. Rachel's parents became strong advocates for victims' families, speaking at community events and schools about the dangers of toxic relationships, substance abuse, and peer pressure. George, Rachel's father, told a local reporter in 2013, "It wasn't just about drugs or jealousy. It was about lost kids. Kids who needed help and didn't get it in time." He said that what hurt the most was knowing that his daughter had died trying to help someone, the very same person who would ultimately betray her. Tiffany's close friends also started an annual scholarship in her name for students pursuing careers in social work, honoring her dream of helping others. "We wanted something positive to come out of all this darkness," one of her classmates said. As for Christine's family, they largely withdrew from public view. Her mother, Lori, who once defended her daughter's innocence, stopped giving interviews altogether. In a brief statement, years later, she said, "Christine was a loving, funny, and bright girl once. Drugs took that from her. They took her soul long before the crime ever did." Inside prison, Christine has reportedly struggled with mental health issues and continued substance dependency treatment. Fellow inmates have described her as quiet and withdrawn, spending most of her time reading or drawing. A former cellmate later told an interviewer that Christine would sometimes wake up screaming in the middle of the night, crying out the names Tiffany and Rachel. In 2021, a true crime documentary revisited the case, bringing it back into public attention. The filmmakers managed to obtain never-before-seen police footage from Christine's interrogations, showing her shifting stories, emotional breakdowns, and the moment she finally admitted to being present during the killings. Viewers were divided. Some saw a frightened addict manipulated by a violent boyfriend, while others saw a calculating young woman masking her guilt behind tears. The case has since become a chilling cautionary tale, one often discussed in psychology and criminology courses for its mix of emotional trauma, codependency, and escalating violence. Experts have noted how Christine's early life, marked by bullying, insecurity, and desperate attachment, made her vulnerable to manipulation and addiction, yet not absolved of responsibility. As of today, The memory of the Clear Lake murders lives on as one of Texas's most infamous crimes, a tragedy born from betrayal and addiction that destroyed 6 lives in total, 4 young victims, 1 dead killer, and a girl who lost everything she once was, at a candlelight memorial on the 20th anniversary of the murders in July 2023. Rachel's father stood before the small crowd and said softly, "I used to ask God why. Why them? Why her? But now, I just ask that their stories remind someone else, maybe one lost kid out there, that there's always another way. You don't have to let pain turn into hate. The man who did this is gone now. He was cruel, a predator who destroyed everything in his path. And yet, my daughter is the one paying for his sins. My daughter doesn't deserve this. My daughter is a victim too. It's hard to know what truly happened on that fateful afternoon, or why it did. Police say there were 6 people at the scene. 5 of them are gone, and the only one left isn't talking. Maybe that means we'll never really know the whole truth. But what we do know is that the aftermath of that terrible day still lingers. Rachel's father once called it an earthquake, one that shattered families and left scars that time couldn't heal. Marcus's stepfather said, "Our lives are very different now. We see things differently, and we know we'll never again feel the hope we once had." As the rain falls gently and the night grows deeper, thank you for joining me here at Crime Whisper. True crime stories remind us not only of the darkness in others, but of the fragility of peace in our own lives. So as you drift into sleep tonight, remember, awareness is our light in the shadows. Until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.